Welcome to Congress in Context. We're your dedicated deep dive into what's really happened on Capitol Hill. Our mission today, well, it's to dig into recent congressional activity, find those key nuggets of knowledge, and help you understand not just the headlines, but why this stuff actually matters to you. We're focusing on Wednesday, July 9th, 2025. The House was out, but the Senate, very busy.
That's right. And for this deep dive, we're going to look at the key laws being debated, the political maneuvering behind the scenes through speeches and votes. We'll give you the context you need, and then think about what it all means for the future, for everyday Americans, basically trying to cut through the complexity and give you clear, useful insights.
Okay, sounds good. Let's jump right in then. Let's unpack some of the big legislative moves, the key votes from this past week, and maybe start with, well, what sounds like a really monumental piece of legislation.
Yeah, the biggest one by far was the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. You'll also hear it called the Reconciliation Bill. Now, this was actually signed into law by the president back on July 4th, but the reactions, they were immediate and very, very strong, polarizing, really.
Right, and supporters, I gather, were pretty enthusiastic. Like Senator Thune, I think, he framed it as a super productive period for Congress.
Exactly. He called it an incredibly productive 6 months for this 119th Congress. Mentioned it was the longest continuous work period in 15 years, most roll call votes since '89. So yeah, for them, it's framed as a historic triumph, a real victory for working families.
Okay, so what's in it that makes them call it a victory? What are the key pieces?
Well, the core is tax relief. They argue it permanently extends the 2017 tax cuts. The idea is to stop what they called a potential $4 trillion tax hike. So that means things like lower rates, bigger standard deduction, double child tax credit, keeping those in place.
Okay, the 2017 stuff. Anything new?
Yes, some new targeted cuts too, like tax cuts on tips. They estimate that could save waiters, barbers, bartenders maybe $1,300. And another one on overtime pay, potentially saving nurses, firefighters, police around $1,400. Also an enhanced deduction, $6,000 for seniors getting Social Security income.
So definitely hitting on taxes.
Yeah.
What else were proponents highlighting?
A lot, actually. Family support, updating the tax code to double child care benefits for parents. That came from the Britt Kane proposal. Then there's border security. They're calling it a generational investment. To finish the wall, hire thousands more Border Patrol agents.
All right.
Energy, too. Big focus on unleashing American energy. That means unlocking about 4 million acres for coal leasing pretty quickly within 90 days and mandating oil and gas leasing.
Wow, okay. Healthcare.
Yeah. They say it strengthens rural health care, sets up a rural hospital fund, and this is a big one, implements work requirements for Medicaid for able-bodied adults without kids. The argument there is it cuts waste, fraud, and abuse. But they were very clear. Proponents stressed zero cuts to their Medicaid benefits for people in Tennessee, for example.
Interesting specifics. And anything else major?
Yeah, a program for newborn savings accounts starting with a $1,000 deposit and some very specific benefits mentioned for Iowa and Wyoming, supporting renewable fuels, extending an agribiodiesel tax credit, disaster aid for farmers, changes to the death tax, and the HITS Act requiring DNA tests and fingerprinting for unaccompanied children at the border to fight trafficking, plus more money for Oak Ridge National Lab and the Coast Guard in Memphis. So quite a mix.
Quite a mix indeed. But as you said, polarizing. This bill also got tagged the big ugly bill by critics. So let's hear the other side. What was the pushback?
The pushback was fierce. Multiple senators argued the impact would be, well, severely negative, especially on health care. The claim was it would take health insurance away from 17 million Americans through what they called deep Medicaid cuts. They even cited a Penn study on the Hauser version predicting something like 51,000 preventable deaths a year because of it.
Wow, that's a stark number.
It is. And they argued it's not just hypothetical, saying it's already shutting down hospitals in rural areas, cutting off health care.
Yeah.
Forcing people to delay care or just rely on ERs, which, drives up costs for everyone else.
So healthcare is a major battleground. What about the tax side from their perspective?
Critics basically said these aren't broad tax cuts. They mainly renew tax cuts for the wealthiest people in America. The example often cited was Elon Musk potentially getting a $346,000 tax break.
Okay, so very different framing on who benefits. And it wasn't just healthcare and taxes, right? You mentioned food assistance and energy earlier.
Exactly. Opponents accuse the bill of containing a multi-hundred-billion-dollar cut to the SNAP program, food stamps, essentially, framing it as taking away food from hungry kids and families.
And the energy piece. the unleashing American energy part.
Yeah, critics called that pointless, economically suicidal, and self-destructive. They slammed the phasing out of tax credits for solar and wind, replacing them with credits for coal mining starting in 2025. Their prediction: energy bills will go up, way up by hundreds of dollars a month, makes the U.S. reliant on old tech, hurts our economic edge, especially while, China's installing huge amounts of solar power, like 100 panels every second.
That comparison is striking.
And one more link made by critics was to the VA, the Department of Veterans Affairs. They pointed to an earlier administration plan, later abandoned after, quote, blistering backlash to fire 83,000 people. Even without that, 30,000 employees apparently left. Critics called this a reduction in force that was decimating the VO workforce, connecting it to the broader context of the bill's approach to government services.
Okay, so the takeaway here seems crystal clear. What one side paints as a landmark achievement for families and the economy, the other sees as, well, a disaster for social programs, the environment, and fairness. It really highlights those deep divides. So, moving beyond that massive bill, what else was the Senate working on? Any less contentious items?
Well, there was some unanimous action. Lulu's law, that's Senate Bill 2229, it actually unanimously passed the Senate. This one basically gives local, state, tribal, federal authorities the power to quickly send out wireless emergency alerts if there's a shark attack.
Shark attack alerts. Okay, what's the story there?
It was inspired by Lulu Gribben, an Alabamian girl who sadly lost her arm and leg in an attack in Florida, and also Elizabeth Foley, who lost a hand just hours earlier in a separate incident. So a very specific response to tragic events. It's now waiting for the House to act on it.
Good to see that kind of bipartisan response is still possible.
Okay.
Looking ahead, what's next on the Senate's immediate agenda? Any votes coming up?
Yes, they've got votes scheduled for Thursday, July 10th, specifically on motions to invoke cloture for 2 nominations. First is Jonathan Gould for Controller of the Currency, and second is Whitney D. Hermendorfer for the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals.
Cloture, right. That's the vote to end debate and move forward.
Exactly. It usually requires 60 votes, so it's a key procedural hurdle. If cloture is invoked for Jonathan Gould, his confirmation vote is set for 1:45 p.m. Thursday.
Okay, so nominations moving forward. And while these big debates happen, there's always a stream of other bills being introduced covering all sorts of things, right?
Absolutely. The legislative hopper is always busy. Too many to list them all, but just to give you a flavor. There was S. 2218 about giving a combat status identifier to drone crews, the remotely piloted aircraft crews involved in combat. S. 2222 aimed at enhancing the security of undersea communication cables, specifically those important for Taiwan's security against China.
Interesting.
And S. 2231 focused on protecting human rights and opportunities for LGBTQI people globally, had a lot of TOS sponsors. Also, S. 2233, which would change the rules for labeling beef products as product of USA.
So a real range. And speaking of moving forward, you mentioned nominations. Some key ones were actually confirmed this week, but it sounds like not without some debate.
That's right. The Senate spent quite a bit of time confirming presidential nominees. Preston Griffith of Virginia is now Undersecretary of Energy. That vote was 54 to 43. Bryan Bedford from Indiana was confirmed as FAA Administrator for a 5-year term. That was 53 to 43.
The FAA confirmation, I heard that one drew some fire.
It did. One senator strongly opposed him, arguing Bedford showed a callous disregard for safety rules, specifically mentioning the 1,500-hour rule. That rule came about after the Flight 3407 crash back in 2009, requiring more flight hours for first officers. The argument against Bedford was that he'd, quote, prioritize profits over passenger safety. So yeah, a significant fight over that one.
Right. Shows how even these appointments can touch on really fundamental issues like safety regulation versus business concerns. Who else got confirmed?
Scott Kupor of California is the new director of the Office of Personnel Management. That was a close vote, 49 to 46. And William Briggs of Texas was confirmed as Deputy Administrator of the Small Business Administration, the SBA. That was 49 to 45.
Another close one. Was that contentious too?
Yes, it was. Again, one senator voiced strong opposition, citing chaos and cuts and confusion at SBA. They raised concerns about a lack of transparency on proposed agency cuts and eliminating programs focused on diversity and equity.
But presumably there was support for him too.
Oh, yes. The counter-argument praised Briggs as sharp, steady, and an entrepreneur. Supporters said he would make the SBA more accountable, more efficient, more transparent. So again, you see these nominations becoming proxies for broader debates about the role and efficiency of government agencies.
Definitely. And beyond the votes themselves, the Senate floor saw some pretty powerful speeches, didn't it?
Yeah.
Highlighting these political divides, especially around spending. I know the president's proposed rescissions package basically cuts to already approved spending, got a lot of airtime. What was the argument for making those cuts, about $9.1 billion?
The main proponent we heard from, Senator Kennedy, really framed it as common sense, identifying wasteful and inappropriate uses of taxpayer dollars. He said it was gut check time for people who say they want less spending.
Did he give specific examples of this alleged waste?
He did. He listed things like $3 million to Iraq for Sesame Street, $3 million to Zambia for circumcisions and vasectomies, $500,000 to Rwanda for electric buses, also $67,000 for insect powder for kids in Madagascar, $3.6 million to Haiti for things like pastry classes and cyber cafes, even mentioning male prostitutes, and $833,000 related to a contract involving transgender people and sex workers in Nepal. The argument was basically, this is money we shouldn't be spending.
Okay, so painting a picture of frivolous spending abroad. But I imagine the opposition had a very different take, especially on cuts closer to home.
A very different take. A whole group of senators, Durbin, Wyden, Cantwell, Baldwin, Klobuchar, Lujan, Blunt, Rochester, Markey, Welch pushed back hard. They were particularly focused on a proposed $1.1 billion cut to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting.
CPB, right?
Yeah.
Public radio and TV.
Mhm.
What was their concern there?
They argued it would be devastating, potentially hitting over 1,500 local stations, creating news deserts, particularly in rural areas. And crucially, they said it would eliminate life-saving emergency and weather alerts.
Emergency alerts. That seems critical.
Absolutely. They gave examples from recent events, flooding in Alaska, Alabama, Central Texas, where public broadcasting alerts were vital. They also stressed the loss of educational programming like PBS Kids and unique local shows. And they pushed back against the idea that public media is biased, highlighting its nonpartisan local reporting and community service role.
That point about emergency alerts really lands, especially given the recent tragedy in Texas you mentioned.
Exactly. That became a very real-world example in this debate. Several senators spoke movingly about the deadly flash floods in central Texas, mentioning 8-year-old Sarah Marsh from Alabama who died, and members of the Santana family from Mobile, also Alabama, who were missing. It really underscored the argument that cuts to services like public broadcasting aren't abstract. They can have life or death consequences.
A powerful reminder. So, beyond CPB, what other cuts in that rescissions package drew fire?
Opponents also sounded the alarm on cuts to major international aid programs, like PEPFAR, the big HIV/AIDS program credited with saving millions of lives, and cuts to global health efforts tackling Ebola, malaria, bird flu, plus funding for UNICEF. Even the USAID Food for Peace program, which, they pointed out, actually benefits American farmers too.
So both domestic and international impacts.
Yes, and another huge one was a potential cut of almost half to the National Institutes of Health. NIH.
NIH, that's massive for medical research.
Exactly. Opponents argued this would halt clinical trials, stop development of new treatments for cancer, Alzheimer's, HIV/AIDS, you name it. The debate also touched on broader cuts across the federal workforce, impacting everything from nuclear safety staff and bird flu specialists to mine safety, the Department of Education, NASA, NOAA, the National Weather Service, even Social Security. So the core disagreement here is really fundamental. What one side calls waste, the other calls an essential public service or a vital investment.
It's a recurring theme. And the debates weren't just about budgets, right? Senator Whitehouse gave another one of his climate speeches, number 300, I think.
That's right, his 300th Time to Wake Up speech. He stayed laser-focused on the looming dangers caused by fossil fuel pollution and what he termed a bitter sense of failure in Congress to act on climate. His argument, it's become quite pointed. He essentially connects 3 major issues he sees as disasters for America: the capture of the Supreme Court by right-wing billionaires, the flood of corrupting special interest dark money in elections, and the success of the fossil fuel climate denial operation. He argues these are all linked, driven by fossil fuel interests.
So he's drawing a direct line from money in politics to the courts to inaction on climate change.
Precisely. He specifically talked about the court being in a captured state, mentioning a billionaire gift program for justices. He called for ethics reform, term limits for justices.
How did he connect this to everyday economics?
He brought up the huge economic risks, cited a Deloitte study estimating a $220 trillion difference in global GDP by 2070, depending on climate action. And he highlighted warnings from financial regulators, even the Fed chair, about insurance and mortgage markets essentially melting down in places like Florida. Mentioned average insurance costs there hitting $14,000 a year and predicted to double, triple, maybe quadruple.
That's staggering. What's his proposed solution?
His main focus is putting a price on carbon pollution globally. He pointed to the European Union's carbon border adjustment mechanism, basically a tariff on high carbon imports, as the, quote, best prospect. He also pushed again for the Disclose Act, which would require donors giving over $10,000 to political groups to be identified. His line was, "Truth is our superpower." So his view is that systemic reforms around money and influence are needed to tackle the climate crisis.
A very structural critique. And then we heard another broad critique. This one aims squarely at the administration's overall direction. Senator Schiff laid out a top 10 list.
Yes, a top 10 list of ways he argues the administration is, quote, wrecking the country. It was a comprehensive counter-narrative.
Okay, what were some of the points?
It covered a lot. Number 10 was what he called a war on America's research universities. Cutting funding, banning international students, raising taxes, threatening accreditation. Number 9 was taking away food from hungry kids via those S&P cuts we discussed. Number 8, destroying alliances and aligning with dictators. He called the approach a protection racket. Number 7 was that pointless, economically suicidal attack on renewable energy, shifting from solar and wind back to coal. Number 6, a broader attack on health and science, pointing again to the big potential NIH cuts. Number 5 was about massive cuts to the federal workforce and agencies across the board, nuclear safety, bird flu staff, NASA, NOAA, Social Security, arguing it's killed the trust in government jobs.
Okay, that's halfway through. What were the top 4?
Number 4 was tariffs. He called them ill-considered, ill-executed, unpredictable, unproductive, costly, and so on. Estimated they cost households $2,300 a year. Mentioned Amazon hiding the Trump tax. Number 3, the attack on healthcare, specifically framing the $1 trillion cut to Medicaid as funding tax cuts for the wealthy.
Number 2,
undermining the rule of law. He cited pardons for January 6 participants, dismissing a corruption case against a mayor, the president accepting gifts without investigation.
and his number 1 point.
Number 1 was destroying the very idea of America. He defined that idea as the belief that anyone from any corner of the earth can come to live in America and become American, contrasting it sharply with current policies. So, you see, it wasn't just about individual policies, but arguing they form a pattern that fundamentally harms the country's values and structures.
A very strong indictment. Okay, one last area before we pull back for analysis. There was also some focus on just the basics of how our system is supposed to work.
Yeah.
Right, civic engagement.
Yes, Senator Grassley brought that up. He highlighted the importance of civic education and participation. He noted some pretty concerning statistics like 70% of Americans failing a basic civic literacy test, 17% not even being able to name one branch of government.
Wow.
Yeah, but he also commended efforts, specifically in Iowa, to boost civic engagement at colleges and universities. It's a reminder that beneath all the policy fights, there's this foundational need for citizens to be informed and involved for the whole system to function.
Absolutely. Okay, so we've journeyed through massive bills, specific laws, heated debates, nominations, critiques. Quite a week. Stepping back, what's the big picture context here? What does it all mean?
Well, when you put it all together, the most striking thing is just how radically different the narratives are. It's almost like describing two different realities. On one side, you have this story of incredible productivity, of getting things done, boosting the economy, giving power back to states and families through tax cuts and deregulation, particularly in energy. This view emphasizes speed, efficiency, lots of confirmations, lots of legislative action. It's a narrative of a government actively reshaping things.
Right. But the other side sees that same activity completely differently.
Completely. From that perspective, these actions are causing severe harm. They're hurting vulnerable people, gutting essential public services like healthcare and food aid, undermining environmental progress, and maybe even damaging democratic norms and institutions.
No.
It's a narrative of policies benefiting a select few while imposing heavy costs on the many and the future.
So it really forces a fundamental question for you, the listener, doesn't it? How do we, as a country, strike that balance?
Exactly. How do we balance economic goals with the need for social safety nets for public services? The fight over the one big beautiful bill, the rescissions package. These aren't just policy tweaks. They're clashes over the fundamental role and size of government. You see this constant tension, individual economic freedom versus collective responsibility, finding waste versus cutting vital lifelines. It depends entirely on your perspective.
And the way these things get done, the processes involved, that tells us a lot too, doesn't it? Like using reconciliation.
Absolutely. Using reconciliation for that big bill, well, it shows how a majority party can use specific Senate rules to pass major budget-related legislation with just 51 votes, bypassing the usual need for 60 votes to overcome a filibuster. It's a powerful tool, but often leads to more partisan outcomes.
Right. It avoids the need for broader consensus.
Exactly. And then you have the fight over the president's rescissions package, trying to claw back money Congress already appropriated. That, plus things like court challenges over environmental funds, really highlights the constant push and pull between Congress and the White House, and the court stepping in to referee. It also shines a light on the influence game, the role of money, special interests, lobbying that Senator Whitehouse talked about, shaping these policy battles behind the scenes.
So looking forward now, what are the immediate implications? What should we be watching for in the coming days and weeks?
Well, the budget process rolls on. The Senate Appropriations Committee is working on spending bills for fiscal year 2026 this week, 3 of them. Plus, the National Defense Authorization Act, the big military policy bill, is also moving. These are must-pass items eventually. But the talk we're hearing already about potential government shutdowns if bipartisan deals aren't reached by October, that tells you the political tensions aren't going away. Expect more brinkmanship.
And thinking longer term, some of these policy shifts, especially on climate and energy, seem like they could have really profound consequences.
Profound is the right word. The clash between pushing fossil fuels and cutting clean energy incentives, that's not just an abstract debate. It has huge long-term economic and environmental impacts. Think about those warnings on insurance markets, mortgages, real estate values in vulnerable areas.
Yeah.
And it affects our international competitiveness, especially when other major economies like China are doubling down on renewables. Big geopolitical shifts could follow.
And beyond specific policies, there's this ongoing challenge to the institutions themselves. You mentioned trust.
Yeah, and that raises a really important question. How durable are agreements in this environment? If one side feels like a bipartisan deal can just be torn up later by executive action, like the arguments around the rescissions package, does that make future cooperation harder? Plus, the calls for more transparency in campaign finance, for ethics reform at the Supreme Court, they point to a deeper worry about public trust in our core institutions. That lack of trust could fuel even more polarization down the road.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, let's turn back to you, our listener. How can you engage with all this complexity?
Well, first, if you want to actually read the bills we talked about, like the One Big Beautiful Bill Act or Lulu's Law, the best place to go is congress.gov. It's the official source. You can find the bill text, who sponsored it, its current status. It's really an invaluable resource for getting the facts straight from the source.
And remember, your own voice can make a difference in these debates.
Absolutely. Contacting your senators, your representative, it's always an option. Tell them what you think. Their contact info is easy to find on their websites. And we saw an example of public pressure having an impact with that VA staffing issue. The blistering backlash made a difference. Citizen engagement matters.
And for just keeping up with what's happening day to day.
Beyond the official sites, seek out trusted news sources. And, despite the funding debate we discussed, public broadcasting often remains a key source for nonpartisan local news and those critical emergency alerts, especially if you're in a rural area. Also, keep an eye on committee schedules for hearings and watch for those upcoming votes on nominations and the big appropriations bills. Those are key decision points.
And it's worth remembering, participation isn't just about Election Day.
No, it's ongoing. Like Senator Grassley said, fostering civic knowledge and participation is fundamental. And, when you hear tributes to long-serving public servants like Martha Cranley or Larry Martin mentioned in the proceedings, it's a good reminder that our system relies on active, engaged citizens at all levels.
So maybe the final thought we leave you with today is this. In a time when things feel so divided, so polarized, what difference could a real, renewed focus on civic duty, on community-level engagement, actually make? What role could you play, maybe, in bridging some of these divides and influencing the direction of policy? Something to think about. That concludes our deep dive into the recent activity on Capitol Hill. Thanks for joining us on Congress in Context.